Okay, so there's this tension, right? You probably feel it sometimes in faith communities.
Mm-hmm.
This feeling that you have to choose between focusing on, saving souls for the afterlife
Right.
or focusing on fixing social problems right here, right now.
Mm-hmm.
People get labeled, kingdom Christians, cross Christians.
Yeah, those labels definitely get thrown around.
But what if?
Yeah.
What if that whole divide is actually missing the point?
That's exactly what these sources we've been digging into suggest. They argue it's a misunderstanding, really.
Okay, so we've got this collection of articles, research notes, and they challenge this separation pretty directly.
They do.
So our mission for this deep dive is basically to unpack that. How do these sources argue that Jesus' ministry actually brought compassion and healing together with proclaiming the kingdom?
Into what they call a holistic kingdom ministry.
Exactly. We want to pull out the key insights. What does that look like? And why do the sources say it's, essential for following Jesus today?
Well, the sources often start right there with that perceived split. And they argue, often drawing on thinkers like N.T. Wright, that it's actually kind of a recent thing, historically speaking.
Oh, interesting. So not how it always was.
Not according to them. If you look at the Gospels, Jesus' own life and ministry, you see these things completely woven together. The cross and the kingdom aren't opposites.
Okay.
Individual salvation transforming society. It's all meant to be connected.
And the sources trace how they got separated.
Yeah, they point fingers, gently perhaps, but they point towards things like the Enlightenment. They suggest it pushed the sort of rival eschatology.
Rival eschatology. Sounds intense. What's that mean?
Basically, eschatology is about, the end times or ultimate things. The sources argue the Enlightenment kind of wanted to position itself as the big turning point in history.
Instead of Jesus' death and resurrection.
Exactly. And that encouraged separating things, religion over here, politics over there, faith walled off from daily life, the spiritual cut off from the material, things that in the first century were seen as much more integrated.
Okay, that makes sense.
And flowing from that, they identify what they call a dangerous mistake.
Which is?
Narrowing down what atonement means. We tend to think of it almost only as, forgiving my individual sins so I can go to heaven.
Which is important, obviously.
Hugely important. But the sources argue that focusing only on that misses the bigger picture. It neglects the whole problem of evil and suffering and brokenness in the world, which the atonement was also meant to start fixing.
Wow. So atonement isn't just about my personal ticket to heaven, but about God starting to put the whole world right.
That's the argument. It's about beginning to restore everything, the whole cosmos.
Okay, that reframing feels pretty significant already.
Yeah.
So how did Jesus himself model this more holistic picture?
Well, the sources constantly bring it back to his compassion. That verse in Matthew 9, He saw the crowds harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd, and his heart went out to them.
Right.
And that compassion wasn't just some vague feeling about their souls someday. It absolutely included their immediate, present, earthly suffering. Their hunger, their sickness, their oppression.
So it covered both their eternal state and their current reality.
Absolutely. And crucially, that compassion drove his actions. It wasn't just passive sympathy.
How so?
Look at when he sent out his disciples. He didn't just say, go preach. He explicitly told them, proclaim the kingdom and heal the sick, cast out demons, meet people's needs.
So the actions weren't just like proof the message was true.
The sources argue no, not just proof. The actions were the message in practice. They were the kingdom breaking in. They were an extension of Jesus' own compassionate ministry.
Okay, so it's not choosing preaching or helping, it's this radical both hand.
Exactly. The sources call it the holistic nature of the kingdom gospel. Jesus is Lord of all of it, every part of life.
They use that Abraham Kuyper quote, don't they?
Oh yeah, the famous one. Not a square inch in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine.
That really captures it.
And you see this historically, the sources point out. Wherever the gospel really took root, things started changing tangibly. Hospitals started popping up.
Why hospitals specifically?
Because, the argument goes, the body matters to God. Jesus healed people's physical bodies. So his followers felt this call to participate in healing through prayer, yes, but also through practical care and medicine.
And it wasn't just bodies, right? The sources mentioned education too.
Right. Schools, universities, because the mind matters too. Learning, studying, discovering these can be sacred acts because Jesus is the ultimate source of wisdom, the Logos.
So Christians founded these places not just for theology, but for all kinds of knowledge, seeing it all under God's domain.
That's the historical pattern they highlight. But then they pivot.
To the present day.
Yeah, especially looking at the global north context. They note that despite this history, polls often show Christians aren't necessarily known first and foremost for this kind of broad compassion work anymore.
Hmm. Why do the sources think that is? What happened?
They explore a few possibilities. One is maybe a misreading of Jesus telling us to do good works in secret. Perhaps we've taken that to mean we shouldn't be known for it at all.
Or maybe it's less visible.
That's another point. In places with strong social safety nets, healthcare systems, welfare, basic needs might feel more like entitlements, like rights everyone expects, rather than urgent needs requiring charitable intervention. So the traditional compassion ministry might look different or feel less pressing.
Okay, I could see that.
But a critique the sources really emphasize is this idea of drive-by ministry.
Drive-by ministry, what's that?
It's doing good work, maybe, but without real long-term commitment or relationship. Think of some short-term mission trips you fly in, do a project, fly out. But it can happen locally, too.
Like starting something but not sticking with it.
Exactly. Or tackling a surface need without building trust. The sources mention how hard it is to find people willing to commit to really messy, long-haul, relationship-heavy ministry, like supporting people coming out of prison. That takes incredible consistency and deep trust building.
And that relationship part seems key to this whole holistic idea.
Absolutely central. The sources contrast that sort of transactional help sometimes seen in the North with a model they see working powerfully in the Global South. They call it access ministries.
Access ministries.
Yeah, using practical compassion, meeting a real felt need in the community, like tutoring or clean water or job skills is the way in. The access point to build genuine relationships.
And through those relationships.
You identify who the persons of peace are, people receptive not just to help, but potentially to the message behind the help. It creates natural openings for deeper conversations, for discipleship. Love in action opens the door.
That makes a lot of sense. It feels more organic.
It does. Now, tied into all this is another big piece, the role of God's power, specifically healing and deliverance.
Oh, yeah. The sources acknowledge that this is, a point of divergence, right? Especially in the global north, many believe those kinds of sign gifts stopped, or they just act as if they did.
Right. There's definitely a stream of theology that says they ceased with the apostles. But the research these sources present, particularly looking at what they call kingdom movements around the world, well, it tells a very different story.
What is it? Yeah.
It shows signs and wonders, healings, deliverance, things like that as a, quote, major element in the rapid growth of these movements.
A major element. Really?
Yeah. They cite this striking statistic from polling leaders in these movements. Something like 70 to 80% of all the new churches planted were directly linked to visible displays of God's power meeting real human needs. It confirmed the message being shared.
70 to 80%, that's huge.
It's massive. And they also note how often people come to follow Jesus because of some kind of supernatural experience, maybe a dream, a dramatic answer to prayer, finding freedom from addiction seemingly overnight.
So what are these believers doing differently? Do they have some special technique?
The sources suggest it's actually simpler than that. It's not about technique, it's about obedience. They just take Jesus's commands seriously, like the command to pray for God's kingdom to come, for his will to be done right here in people's lives. They ask for it expectantly and consistently.
Okay, so they just do it. But hearing that and doing it, especially praying for the sick or for deliverance, that can feel really intimidating for a lot of us, maybe awkward. How do the sources suggest bridging that gap?
They tackle that directly. They reframe it. It's not about your power or ability. God is the senior partner, the one with the resources.
Yeah.
The disciple, you're more like a catalyst. You're participating by asking. You're asking for God's kingdom authority to show up and make a difference in this person's situation. It shifts the pressure from performance to faithful participation.
A catalyst, I like that. So how do you actually approach it?
They suggest a spirit-led approach, which might mean, taking a moment to be quiet and listen. But also, importantly, engaging in a real conversation with the person you're praying for.
Asking questions.
Asking questions, yes. Listening to their story. The sources find that as you listen and ask the Spirit for guidance, you might sense things to ask about. It can help pinpoint potential barriers within the person, things in their soul that might be connected to their physical or emotional struggle.
Barriers like what?
Could be anything, really. Maybe unconfessed sin, maybe a destructive pattern. But one thing the sources highlight repeatedly is unforgiveness.
Unforgiveness.
Yeah. They make this, frankly, startling claim based on their observations. Unforgiveness might be a root issue in as many as half of the cases of sickness, bondage, or spiritual blockage they encounter.
Half. Wow.
It's a huge potential barrier. So asking about relationships, about bitterness, about needing to forgive someone, dealing with those heart issues led by the Spirit is often, they find, the key that unlocks healing.
And deliverance, how does that fit in?
Similarly, they say, it's about addressing areas where someone feels stuck, maybe patterns they can't break, strongholds or bondages. It involves confession, repentance, claiming freedom in Jesus' name. Sometimes it's gentle, sometimes it takes more time.
So the core idea is intentional prayer, but combined with really listening to the person and listening for God's guidance for them specifically.
Exactly. And trusting what you sense God is highlighting. They see much higher rates of, well, success, people actually getting healed or set free when prayer happens that way, rather than just a quick generic prayer.
Okay, this is fascinating. Do the sources give examples of this in practice?
Oh, yes. There's a really compelling case study they detail about a pastor, Jimmy Tam, and his church in Southern California.
Tell me about him.
Well, for about 14 years, his church was growing, but really slowly, maybe adding 5 or 6 people a year. Pretty typical, maybe. And their whole focus was getting people to the church building on Sunday.
The classic model.
The classic model. But by 2013, he was feeling frustrated, like there had to be more effectiveness. Then he met someone, Sean Steckbeck, who showed him a totally different approach.
Which was?
Instead of trying to bring people to the church, go out into the community, go to where people are, and just ask simple questions. Things like, do you consider yourself spiritual? Or, if God could do a miracle for you today, what would you want?
Just asking strangers that on the street.
Yeah. Pastor Tam was apparently amazed watching this guy, an American who didn't even speak Chinese, striking up meaningful spiritual conversations and praying for people just by asking these simple, non-threatening questions.
Wow. Did Pastor Tam try it?
He did. And the sources share some really powerful stories. Praying for a shopkeeper who immediately felt physically better. That shopkeeper's niece then got curious. A woman breaking down weeping when he simply offered to pray about her cancer diagnosis. A young guy searching for God but feeling out of place in church.
So real needs, real people, right where they were.
Exactly. Another one. Praying for a woman about a complicated child custody issue, which then opened the door for her and her daughter to eventually get baptized right there outside their home.
Incredible.
So, Pastor Tam got inspired. He launched this simple initiative in his church, the Love Your Neighbor campaign.
What did that involve?
Just asking church members to commit to asking their actual neighbors one question. Is there anything I can pray for you about?
That simple.
That's simple. And the response, according to the sources, was just overwhelming. People started pouring out their hearts, financial struggles, family problems, health issues. And church members started praying and seeing real answers, tangible results.
So people were actually experiencing God's help through prayer.
Yeah, the sources mentioned members discovering they had this gift of intercession they didn't know about and seeing dramatic answers like 50–60% of the time when they prayed for their neighbor's specific needs.
That must have changed things in the church.
Profoundly. It led to this huge mindset shift. The main goal was no longer getting people into the building.
It shifted to
equipping ordinary people, everyone in the church, to be ministers out in the community during their week.
So the focus moved outwards.
Completely. They even changed their language. Sunday service wasn't just church, it became celebration and training.
Ah, signaling that Sunday was preparation?
For the real ministry that happens Monday to Saturday out in people's homes and workplaces and neighborhoods, that became primary.
That's a radical shift.
It is. And there's this one story about a leader named Simon. He had been trying to make a disciple for a year, feeling discouraged.
Okay.
After some prayer, he meets this dad, Will, at his kid's preschool. Simon just shares his own story, his testimony about how Jesus freed him from a gambling addiction.
Okay, just being honest about his own life.
Right. And it turns out Will was struggling deeply with that exact same addiction at that very moment. It resonated instantly, powerfully.
Talk about a divine appointment.
Seriously. And the outcome was incredibly fast. Will and his wife decided they wanted Jesus, got baptized together on Christmas Day. Get this. That same night, Christmas night, Will is selling something on eBay. The buyer sees his Facebook profile picture from the baptism, asks about it, and says they'd been waiting for someone to tell them about Jesus.
No way!
Yes. And Will, this brand new believer, immediately starts sharing scripture stories he just learned with this person he met online.
That's incredible, just hours after being baptized.
Right. It perfectly illustrates that point the sources make, quoting Pat Robertson actually, about God often using, mediocre leaders or unexpected people in situations.
So that the glory goes to God, not the person, like that passage in 1 Corinthians.
Exactly. So God gets the credit.
Okay, so these stories are powerful. But what about the numbers? Did this approach actually lead to growth?
That's the other compelling part. The sources report that by the end of 2016, a few years into this shift, the attendance at the main church building was still around 50 people.
Okay, so the main service didn't explode.
No, but here's the kicker. Another 50 people were now gathering and worshiping Jesus in new house churches that had started organically throughout the community, led by these newly equipped people.
So we doubled.
They doubled. 100% growth. But not by addition to the building, but by multiplication outside the building.
That's a completely different way of thinking about church growth.
It really is.
So, wrapping this all together, what's the core takeaway from these sources?
I think the line they use really sums it up. The gospel of the kingdom is more than we have imagined.
More than just getting souls saved, more than just social action.
Yes. It's about God's people acting as his ambassadors, actively bringing his reign, his peace, his wholeness, his justice, his healing into every single part of life on earth.
And the sources are pretty strong on this point, right? That splitting the gospel, picking just one part.
They argue it's basically misrepresenting God. It's like showing only one facet of his character. They say if you bifurcate the gospel, you're only advancing your preferred bit of God's kingdom, not his full intention.
Bifurcate. Strong word.
It is. They see it as a serious issue.
So the call then coming out of these sources is...
It's a call to embrace the whole thing, to align with God's holistic vision for his kingdom. That, they argue, is how you step into the fullest, deepest purposes God has for you and for the world around you.
So for you listening, how does this land? Does this idea of a holistic kingdom challenge your own perspective on what it means to follow Jesus?
Yeah, what might it look like for you, right where you are, to start weaving together compassion, real relationships, and that spiritual dimension of prayer and expecting God to act?
Maybe thinking about your own neighborhood, your workplace, your network.
Yeah.
What's one specific, tangible need you see?
Could that need be the starting point, the invitation for you to step into this kind of relational access ministry, really expecting God to show up with his power and his love as you reach out?